Final Fantasy VII made me a fan of the franchise and encouraged me to enjoy a different video game genre that had gone unappreciated in my life. As the years progressed, I grew more enamored with not only the series but also the genre as a whole, with multiple years and even gaming generations hinging on the releases of Final Fantasy games. Having been disappointed with Final Fantasy XII, Final Fantasy XIII did the franchise a further injustice, featuring style over substance, bland characters, and an overly convoluted story that would become even more unmanageable thanks to the releases of 2 sequels. Ironically, the underwhelming trilogy that was Final Fantasy XIII was to have a companion exclusive for the PlayStation 3, titled Final Fantasy Versus 13. An action RPG looked to present a darker side of the world seen in its namesake. Development woes that plagued 12 and 13 destroyed any chance of seeing Versus released on the console it was intended for, as the game was eventually given the official number treatment and renamed Final Fantasy 15. Unlike the last 2 offline numbered Final Fantasies, I kept my emotions and expectations tempered, ready to enjoy what was delivered, but not expecting it to change my world as a gamer as its predecessors had done in the past. Though development problems hindered the game's release, the outpouring of information pre-release gave gamers a good indication of what was to expect when it came to all aspects of Final Fantasy XV, including the refined combat system, the game's lore, and its characters such as the only person the player could control in battle, Noctis. With his trio of guardians and best friends alike, Noctis is sent from his home in hopes of marrying his childhood friend and goddess-blessed Oracle Lunafreya, with the wedding producing a peace treaty between Noctis' home and Lunafreya's land in the process. Jumping in the stylish regalia, the game's obvious version of a Cadillac, I took to the world alongside Noctis, progressing through the story at a rather slow pace thanks to the opening of the world to the player in only the 3rd of 14 chapters. With multiple side quests, monster beast hunts, random activities such as fishing, the amount of forward momentum in terms of what would be considered traditional progression was minimum for the first 36 hours or so. But things picked up when I started embracing those warnings of entering a point of no return. By the time I reached the final chapter, my characters were pretty experienced both from a story perspective and from the amount of things I had done to get them over-leveled, not intentionally, mind you. The final scenes and credits roll, rewarding me with a digital certificate that noted I had finished the story at 89 hours. But I wasn't done, taking on the post-game content that shockingly presents even greater challenges, including acquiring legendary weapons, exploring dense dungeons, and even taking down the mighty Animantois. My playtime post-story added at least a dozen hours before the Platinum Trophy popped and I found myself gleefully exhausted thanks to all the time I put into this game. Like every numbered non-sequel Final Fantasy in the past, Final Fantasy XV switches things up from every perspective, be it the story, characters, and most importantly when it comes to this entry, combat. Rather than embrace the turn-based foundation of past games, the developers behind Final Fantasy XV adopted a more action-oriented style of gameplay from battle to battle, where the player only controls Noctis. Noctis can wield up to 4 different weapons at any time, including small and large swords, javelins, guns, and magic. Each weapon type produces different results both aesthetically and against enemies, as weapon types will do various amounts of damage depending on the adversary's weakness. The decision of making weapon types actually mean something in every battle is only a small part about the fast and furious action that comes from this combat system. Noctis can block, parry, counter, and even warp onto or into various objects to swoop down for a perfectly timed warp strike that usually does double damage compared to a regular attack, courtesy of Noctis' magic points. Though a majority of the time Noctis' allies, the eccentric wannabe pro-photographer Prompto, the highly intelligent chef Ignis, and the muscle-bound survivalist Gladiolus will be handling their portion of the combat on their own, the player can have Noctis shout out commands to perform tech attacks that are not only upgradable via the Ascension Grid and AP ability points, earned from leveling up and even completing side quests, but can also produce double team scenarios. There are also blindside and link strike attacks that can provide quick double teams as well, though they are usually random occurrences when the player just so happens to end up colliding with an unprepared enemy. When it comes to the adversaries and enemies of Final Fantasy XV, they are mostly upgraded versions of previous beasts seen in past Final Fantasies, including Behemoths, Malboros, and even Yojimbo. The game's day and night cycle affects the enemy output as night presents the arrival of much stronger demon enemies. Even with that believed lack of creativity, the fact is for the first time in the series' history, do the larger-than-life ideas as to what and who these monsters are finally reach their potential, while delivering impressive battles throughout the game no matter the level. But the combat system isn't perfect. Beyond the problematic situations created by a camera that can become unruly in closed spaces, and hit detection being iffy at times, the more supernatural portions usually connected to the action have been dumbed down and downright disregarded. Magic and summons. When it comes to the prior, magic is given a more alchemic touch by needing to be crafted, taking the core elements of Final Fantasy magic, fire, ice, and thunder. The player can blend the three with each other or various items picked up by fallen enemies. The results are mixed at best, as a majority of the items produce the same spells no matter how much of the elements you throw in the figurative pot. In battle, magic proves to be problematic, as casting a spell can not only hit enemies but also allies, too stupid to move out of the way, even after Noctis warns them what is going to happen if they don't get away from their enemies. Eventually, using magic becomes more problematic than helpful outside of fights, where only one or two enemies are around, thus making those all type of spells ineffective. Then there's the disregarded and summon attacks. While there are summons, the player can't call them into combat at least once a battle at any time, as one of the 4 summons that are obtained during the game will only come to help unleash battle-ending wrath under certain unexplained in-game conditions. 2 of the summons, Leviathan and Titan, barely made appearances in my game, and definitely left me wanting to see the grandeur more often than not. Combat as a whole is definitely one of the best aspects of Final Fantasy XV, even when it becomes hindered by bad hit detection, the shoddy camera in close quarters, and the poor implementation of magic and summons. But combat is only a small portion of what makes a Final Fantasy game great. The story, world, atmosphere, and music usually leave people praising the game over all others in the genre. Final Fantasy XIII struggled to produce the quality traits usually associated with Final Fantasy games. 15, however, does a better job of bringing everything once great about the franchise together, yet fails to fully attain greatness. Case in point, the story is an amalgamation of lore, friendship, and destiny rolled into an extensive multimedia package, featuring a 5-episode anime, a 2-hour full-length movie, and this game. To fully grasp everything about the world of Final Fantasy XV, you have to invest in all 3 things. But what if you don't? Well, that's actually okay, because 15, the game, has a sole story based around the concept of friendship between 4 likable characters, simply chatting it up during a trip from outpost to outpost, either courtesy of the aforementioned regalia or even chocobos that level up the longer one rides it, complimenting each other on a battle well fought, and sleeping under the stars while camping, where everything from the experience points attained from battles and completing missions are tallied and distributed. Prompto's pictures are looked at and either saved or deleted by the player, and the realistic looking meals that are cooked by Ignis that give the characters temporary status boost. On the negative end of the spectrum, the characters, both lead and minor, rarely have any growth or development, let alone scenes to help push the character-specific narratives forward. It's when the game moves beyond the relationship of Noctis and his crew that things fall apart. Almost everything about the story after Chapter 2 is poorly told, and most noticeably rushed, to the point that the player won't have the chance to emotionally digest a majority of what and why things are happening before being ushered to the next all-too-short chapter if said gamer just plays the game for its story, meaning the game will most likely last barely 25 hours for that player. Other than Arden's motivations and actions during the game's final third, nothing about 15's narrative is memorable in a positive manner. One of the biggest reasons the game's story feels even barer is the fact that the world Eros itself is so big, and just like the grandiose lore when only focusing on the game itself, Eros can prove to be incredibly bland outside of its looks. A majority of Eros appears fantastic, from the dusty plains outside of Hammerhead to the Venice-like area of Alticia that would have been perfect for Final Fantasy IX. But once the looks fade into the background, it becomes obvious the extras are bare bones as they come. Side quests are nothing more than fetch quests that don't offer anything memorable, including new characters or narrative moments or even choices. In a world where games like The Witcher 3 exist, where side quests actually feel as important and memorable as the main missions, side quests where a player simply is told to go there, pick up some dog tags, frogs, or food, deliver it, and do it all over again are just not enough anymore. There are also dungeons and a variety of hunts to take part in, but like the other side quests, they eventually bleed into one another to create a long blur of mediocrity. On the other hand are the more playful activities such as fishing, pinball playing, and even betting in a monster battle arena where one can purchase high-end weapons, tools, and accessories. Chocobo racing is also in the game, but nowhere near as entertaining as what was offered in Final Fantasy VII. There's so much stuff to keep the player occupied outside of the story, but the longevity and fun will definitely vary from gamer to gamer. Music in Final Fantasy XV doesn't get enough praise. Thanks to the implementation of old Final Fantasy soundtracks, a lot of gamers will probably ignore the greatness produced here. After being highly disappointed with both Final Fantasy XII and XIII's musical offerings, Final Fantasy XV soundtrack definitely harkens back to the days of delivering memorable sounds throughout the game. There is so much to enjoy about Final Fantasy XV, be it the surprisingly stellar combat, memorable soundtrack, and enjoyable lead characters, but for every positive, there's a strong negative, including a poorly told story, a barren world, archaic side quest presentation, and the overall feeling that there is so much more left on the cutting room floor than what was given to everyone who purchased this latest installment in a franchise that has seen better days. It's crazy in the end just how much this game reminds me of Final Fantasy VIII. A game that used fundamental changes to the gameplay and narrative to create something that is either loved or hated with no middle ground. Final Fantasy XV is going to be this generation's Final Fantasy VIII, as it does things so differently compared to its counterparts that it will either turn gamers against it or have them defending it for being better than a lot of the games that have suffered from developmental hell. But 15's unfulfilled nature is what essentially hurts it more than any fan's opinion or development cycle ever could, as the storytelling, side quest offerings, and even character arc moments are lacking when all the potential is there for something better. Combat, while incredibly enjoyable, can become too easy once the party starts over-leveling, thanks to no fault of the player other than simply trying to enjoy what Final Fantasy XV has to offer. Final Fantasy XV isn't a disappointment, but actually is, as strange as that may sound. It delivers an incredible, unbelievable experience in various ways, yet feels hollow and will leave you wanting more from a franchise that used to deliver hearty offerings in every installment.
Ain't so bad out here once you get used to it.
Still a lot we haven't seen, though.
And a lot for us to do.
Yeah.
Buck up. We're just getting started.